brain power for this one. So you can, because I figure a lot of people are going to get up here and talk about stuff that you probably already know. So I'm trying to contribute something that is a little futuristic and maybe we don't all know yet, and we're trying to figure out all together. Just by way of background, my day job is I run AngelList, which is a network of startups, entrepreneurs, investors. We run a large talent platform that places now a couple of hundred hires a week. It's free, you should check it out. No recruiters, just like open source, there's no middlemen. And we run a fundraising platform that has thousands of angels and about 100,000 companies on there. The generic talk to give here would have been to get up here and talk about open source startups and AngelList, but actually they're all open source. Nobody in their right mind starts a startup these days and runs on closed source. I don't think they'd be fundable, which is an interesting turn of events, because I do remember a time in Silicon Valley when the lawyers would make it hard for open source companies using open source software to get funded. When you were doing your Series A financing with a VC, you'd have to dig in and pull up all the information that showed that all the licenses you were using were good and that you weren't somehow corrupting your own software with a copy left or anything of the sort. And that used to be like a thing that for a little while it looked like the law firms were going to make a little practice out of that. Even early angels would tell their companies, hey, be careful using open source software, it'll make it harder for you to raise money. Well, now if you're built on closed source software, it's pretty much impossible to raise money. The one disappointing exception to that, of course, is mobile, because those ecosystems are controlled by two vendors, but hopefully the open source revolution will make its mark there as well. And now we have VCs who are wearing cool t-shirts and holding open source conferences and looking for open source companies to invest in. So the world has changed, so thank you Salil and crew for doing that. It's interesting that Peter from Andreessen is quoted as being against the open source business model, but I think it's a bit of a straw man too. He's being provocative, and it's ironic because Andreessen Horowitz is probably the VC fund that is doing the most to support Bitcoin. And Bitcoin should be the champion for open source going forward. And why is that? It's because Bitcoin is the first true open source business model that is completely self-sustaining and works. And that's kind of what I'm here to talk about today. And when I say Bitcoin, I kind of mean cryptocurrencies in general. I don't, so we can argue about which coin's going to win, but I just use it because it's shorter than saying cryptocurrencies all day long, which is a bit of a mouthful. So why is Bitcoin so interesting? So here you have an unknown fellow named Satoshi Nakamoto. Nobody kind of knows who he is, although there's lots of guesses, who's basically going to be a self-made billionaire while staying completely anonymous, while never having raised a dime, and having been liquid the entire way, and for having written a piece of code and never having had to hire employees, never having had to fire people, never having had to create a Delaware corporation, never having to have corporate governance, never having had to hire a lawyer, never having to sweat details at night about someone suing him, or them or whoever it is. But this to me is the miracle business model of the future. If you could be a great open source developer and you needed a business model, I would posit to you there's no better place to look than Bitcoin. And what is it that Bitcoin basically does? What Bitcoin basically did was it came around the observation that, hey, if I can write a piece of open source software that then powers a network, and that network can, from the ground up, require some scarce token to operate, then I can get paid in that token. I can keep some percentage of that token early on, and I can then ride that network all the way through, and I've essentially taken my company public on day one. And Satoshi, of course, was smart enough not to use the word IPO because that would get him in trouble with securities law, and he was smart enough to stay anonymous. So there are definitely some legal issues because the current state of the art in securities law does not know how to deal with this innovation. But fundamentally, I think we're going to see the emergence of a new class of applications, open source applications, that are going to have coins underneath, cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin equivalents, that are going to power these networks. And these are going to be app coins. So for example, if you were writing a great piece of open source software tomorrow that was going to create a distributed storage network, like the next BitTorrent sync or the next Dropbox, but you were trying to do an open source version of that. The old version would have been, well, what's my real incentive? I'll write some code, I'll release it, hopefully someone will update it and maintain it. Well, now I would argue that you can actually create an associated cryptocurrency underneath. You can call it a box coin or a Dropbox coin or a storage coin. And instead of providing proof of work like Bitcoin does to secure the network, you can provide proof of storage or proof of availability. And you can pre-mine and keep 10% of that or 5% of that, release the rest of the community, and then as people are early adopters and as they contribute, you can pay them bounties or you can just have them buy in, essentially fund this network as it goes. And over time, people who are providing storage in the network get paid in the coin, people who are asking for storage in the network pay in the coin, and that creates demand for the coin. And Bitcoin, for example, could be a reserve currency that you use on the fly to buy and sell this coin. Similarly, you could power a Tor network. Tor is always running out of gateways and bandwidth. You could allocate scarce resources of bandwidth in a Tor network using a Tor coin. And it's kind of up to your imagination. In some cases, Bitcoin itself will be better, like people will just reuse Bitcoin. But creating your own coin, what it does is it creates an incentive for the developers early on to write robust software and release it while still staying anonymous, while still staying open source, but yet attaching an almost perfect business model in there with no liquidation preference, no preferred stock, no venture capitalists, no angel investors, and your users are your shareholders, and your early adopters are your shareholders, and they can buy in from anywhere in the world. Someone sitting in Panama can take a Bitcoin, translate it into your Tor coin or Dropbox coin, and essentially be an investor in your company. And then as your network gets more and more used, the value of your shares goes up, and of course is liquid the entire way. So that, I posit to you, is the open source business model of the future. If you're writing open source software, you should be thinking about how do I use it to create a network. And right now, this all sounds really hard, but over time, you're going to see libraries emerge that make it just really easy to stitch in a coin-based token mechanism underneath with cryptocurrency and hashing in a blockchain, and maybe even merge mining with Bitcoin so that it's secure from day one. You can look up merge mining. I don't have time to go into it. But the bottom line is that this will be easy. As we know with open source, something only has to be written really well once, and then the rest of us can all use it. So someone is going to write this infrastructure, and people are already starting to do that, and then we're going to have a brand new business model for open source. Apologies, but no venture capitalists required. It's not quite true. I've been approached by coin companies that are raising angel financing, and then they pay out their angels with coin. So what comes after that? Is this, what's interesting here? Is that the end of it? I don't think so. I think it gets even more interesting. If you look at what the Bitcoin blockchain is fundamentally saying, is it's saying we can distribute any kind of decision making that earlier had to be centralized. And one of those sets of decisions that was centralized earlier was around transactions and a ledger and a coin and spending, and so Bitcoin obviously made that distributed. What else can we make distributed? And so there's a series of coins that are now coming up that are trying to do what's called smart contracts. And essentially, every time you make an agreement with anybody else to do something in the future, that is a contract. And that is the basis for all business. So we can actually take all of business and we can turn it into a coin. What does that mean? That means that not only we're going to have open source software like we do today, and not only going to have open source funding like Bitcoin does, but we're going to have open source corporations. We're going to have entire companies that are distributed in the blockchain, that have no officers, that have no CEO, that have distributed owners, and that essentially enter into smart contracts with each other through open source software, and are basically indestructible, incorruptible, and live forever. I know this sounds completely insane, but I encourage you to look up the concept of distributed autonomous corporations. It's a real concept, and logically there's no reason why it won't work. So let me try and describe, and this is where you would never get this over a beer, so I'm glad we're trying this in the morning. Let me try and describe what an open source distributed autonomous corporation would look like. Bitcoin is the first example. You can think of Bitcoin as a shareholder-owned, employee-run, not-for-profit crypto corporation. It cannot be shut down. There's no CEO to fire. There's no one to arrest. The legal contracts around Bitcoin as to how it operates and does business are built into the core protocol. They can be upgraded by 51% of the network agreeing to do it, or the open source developers upgrading the clients, but it's actually very hard to change the rules on Bitcoin, which makes it predictable, which means you may actually want to use it as a currency or as a store of value. Now, you can create additional corporations, and as a crazy example, like let's go back to the Dropbox example. You could have an open source corporation running in the cloud that has this software that essentially builds a distributed storage network, and it uses its own currency. So basically, it pays people to improve itself in shares of itself. So, for example, the users could want more features. Users could say, hey, we want an Android client. There's no Android client for this yet. So there could be a message board on which the users basically bid up what features they want and how badly they want them. And so developers now know what features to build. And the system could automatically give out bounties to the top developers who then contribute to the open source. The top developers whose source is accepted into the main code base then get paid in bounties by the users. Essentially, just like any company, this virtual corporation would be paying in shares of itself. It would be requiring payment in shares of itself. And any profits would be issued as dividends in its own shares. You could even take this all the way to the other extreme, which is you could imagine a vending machine that is running as a distributed autonomous corporation, minting its own coin. And it's paying for coffee, it's paying for repairmen, it's paying for additional resources and snack bars that it wants to sell. It's paying for replicating itself. I know it sounds completely insane, it's the first time I'm talking about it, but you could imagine that these are components that will be built up over time. All of the things that a corporation or a business does is essentially just a series of contracts that it enters into where it exchanges its stored value for future value. All of that can be done in code. Because it can be done, and it can be done through open source, and it only has to be done well once before we fork it and improve it and incorporate it into our own things, I think it will absolutely be done in our lifetimes. And just like open source software was called a toy at the beginning, and just like Bitcoin was called a toy at the beginning, it will be called a toy at the beginning. But I think that's kind of the future of open source. It's not just open source software, it's not just open source financings, but it's off of open source companies, and I think it's inevitable. So that's my little talk.